Hey, my name is Noah Pruitt. I'm 32 years old, and I run a welding and fabrication shop off the county road on the south edge of Stephenville, Texas, where the land is flat and the churches are old, and half the trucks in town have something on them that I either built or put back together. It's a metal building with a roll-up door and a concrete floor stained with 30 years of slag. And I do the unglamorous work that keeps a ranch town running. Gates, cattle guards, trailer hitches that somebody pulled half off in a ditch. Railings for the new houses going up east of the highway. A cracked bucket on a backhoe, a snapped tongue on a stock trailer, a flagpole the wind bent double behind the VFW. People bring me broken steel and I make it whole again, and I charge fair and I do it right, and the work has never once let me down. Which is more than I can say for most things. Here's what I love about it, the thing I've never told anybody. When you drop the hood and strike an arc, the whole world goes away. The visor goes black except for the one point of light where the metal is melting, and the sound of the shop and the road and the radio all drop out. And for those few seconds, it's just dark and quiet, and a single bright seam coming together under your hands. People think welding is loud. From the inside, it's the quietest thing in the world. I chose this work, and I have wondered more than once whether I chose it because of how quiet it is in there. Whether I've spent 15 years building a job out of silence on purpose. Because I grew up in a silent house. My parents were both deaf, capital D, the way they'd want me to write it. Deaf and proud of it, and never once sorry. They met at the School for the Deaf in Austin in the 70s and moved out here where my father's people had land. And they raised me in a house where the doorbell flashed the lights instead of ringing, and the alarm clock shook the bed, and the first language I ever had wasn't English, it was my mother's hands. I could sign before I could talk. And because I was the hearing one, I was also the bridge. From about the age of 5, I was the one who made the phone calls, who stood between my parents and a world that kept talking too fast and too loud. And not to them, but to me, the little boy. Like he was the only real person in the room. I interpreted my mother's questions at the doctor and the bank and the school I myself attended. I translated more times than I want to remember. The exact moment a hearing person decided my parents were stupid, and I had to put that on my own face and hand it to the two people I loved most. My father died 6 years ago. Heart in his sleep, in that same house, and my mother Marlene still lives there, 66 now, sharp as a tack and twice as funny, and I see her every Sunday. But somewhere in my 20s, I did a thing I'm not proud of and didn't even fully notice doing. I split myself in two. There's the hearing Noah, the quiet welder everybody in Stephenville knows, who talks about the cowboys and the weather and never mentions a thing about how he was raised. And there's the other one, the one whose hands know a whole language. The one who only comes out on Sundays at his mother's kitchen table. Nobody in this town has ever seen me sign. I kept it private the way you keep a door shut on a room you can't stand to be in and can't stand to leave. I told myself it was rest. I'd been the bridge my whole childhood, and I was tired. And a man's allowed to be just one thing if he wants, and being just the hearing welder was easy. The phone doesn't light up much after dark in either world. I'd made my peace with being half a person in two places. And then, on a Thursday in February, my buddy Dale and his wife Renee told me, grinning like they'd invented matchmaking, that they'd set me up on a date. And that's where everything I'd kept shut started to come open. Renee knew her through the church. There's a Methodist church downtown with windows over 100 years old. And one of them had buckled, and the committee had hired an artist who'd moved to the area to restore it. And Renee had spent a month watching this woman work and decided she was the loveliest, loneliest thing she'd ever seen, and that I, the quiet welder, was exactly the kind of patient man who'd be good to her. Her name's Hazel, Renee told me. Now Noah, she's deaf. But she reads lips real good, and we'll all be there, and I just thought, two real solid people. Why not? Dale clapped me on the shoulder like he'd done me a favor. I almost said no. I want to be honest about that. I came that close. Because I knew the second Renee said it, exactly what kind of evening they had cooked up without meaning any harm by it. Two hearing people who decided the deaf girl and the quiet guy were both a little broken and should maybe be broken together, and a notepad on the table and everybody talking slow. I'd spent my whole life in that room. I had no desire to spend a Friday night in it. But I'd run out of reasons that didn't require explaining myself. And explaining myself meant opening the shut door, so I said fine. I said I'd come. The restaurant was the kind of loud chain place out by the interstate, the worst possible room for it, and they were already at the table when I got there. Dale and Renee on one side, and across from them a woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere on earth. She was maybe 28. Dark hair pulled back hard, a few pieces come loose around a face that was bracing itself. And she had on a denim jacket with paint or solder flux stains worn into the cuffs and a man's flannel under it. Dressed like someone who works with her hands and got told at the last minute this was nicer than she'd planned for. Her hands were on the table, very still, the stillness of someone holding herself ready. And her eyes did this thing when I sat down. A quick flick to the door and back, the math of a person already calculating how soon she could leave without being rude. There was a notepad by her plate. Dale had put it there. She hadn't touched it. It started exactly the way I knew it would. Renee leaned across the table toward her and said, too brightly, mouth working too hard, "Hi, Hazel, this is Noah." And then turned to me and said, in her regular voice, the voice you use about someone, not to them, "She reads lips great, so just face her when you talk, okay? And speak up a little." Hazel watched Renee's mouth, and her own face did something I knew in my bones. It went smooth and pleasant and 1,000 miles away, the exact expression my mother used to put on in a waiting room, when a nurse crouched down to talk to 6-year-old me about my own mother's appointment. The expression of a person who has decided, again, to endure being talked around in a room that thinks it's being kind. And something opened up in me that I'd kept welded shut for 15 years. I lifted my hands. And I signed to her, fast, easy, the way you only sign when it's your first language and not your 51st. I didn't sign at her. I signed to her directly, the way you talk to a person. Don't run yet, I signed. I know exactly what this is. They set us up like two broken things that ought to match. They mean well. They have no idea I grew up in this language. My parents are deaf. So here's my offer. Let's not tell them. Let them sit there for a while with no idea what we're saying. They have earned a little of that. The table went dead silent. Renee's fork stopped in the air. Dale's mouth came open. Two hearing people who had built the whole evening around the deaf girl not being able to follow along were suddenly the only two people at the table with no idea what was being said. And they sat there blinking at my hands like they'd watched a dog start reciting poetry. Hazel stared at me. The smooth, pleasant, faraway look cracked right down the middle. And then her hands came up, sharp and quick, testing me. And I'll never forget what she signed. The corner of her mouth already going. Anyone can learn 10 signs to show off at a deaf girl. I signed back without a beat. Idiomatic, the slang you only have if you were raised in it. A joke about Renee's lip pursing that doesn't translate cleanly to English and made Hazel's whole face change. She laughed out loud, a real one, the kind that surprises the person it comes out of. And Renee said, "Faint." What? What's so funny? What did he say? And neither of us answered her. And Hazel looked at me for a long second with something completely new in her eyes and signed slow this time, like she was setting something down carefully. Okay, you're real. I did not see that coming. We left 20 minutes later. Hazel told Dale and Renee out loud in her own voice, which she used when she chose to and not because anyone made her, that it was lovely to meet them and that Noah was going to drive her home. And we walked out into the parking lot, leaving the two of them stunned in the booth. And the second the doors closed behind us, Hazel turned to me under the parking lot light and signed, "Buy me a real dinner somewhere quiet. You owe me after that." And I did. That's how I met Hazel Reyes, who was 28, who had moved to Stephenville 2 years before for cheap studio space and big skies, and to get 300 miles from a man in Dallas, and who made stained glass, restored the old church windows, and built her own commissions. Panels she sold to galleries in Austin and Fort Worth that I would later learn went for more money than I made in a month. She was the most quietly arrogant person I'd ever met. In the good way, the earned way. She knew exactly how good she was at her work, and she did not pretend otherwise to make anyone comfortable. And after a lifetime of being treated like a fragile thing, she developed a dry, merciless sense of humor that she deployed mostly against people who deserved it, and sometimes against me. Her studio was an old feed store she'd half converted, north light pouring through the big front windows. And the first time I went there, I understood her work and my work were the same work. She showed me how she built a window, how she cut the glass and wrapped the edges in copper foil or fit them into channels of lead came, and then ran a bead of hot solder down every seam to lock the whole shattered-looking thing into one panel that would hold for 100 years. I stood there in her flux-smelling studio with colored light all over the floor, and I told her, signing, "That's what I do. That's exactly what I do. I just do it with steel and you do it with light." And she looked at me and signed back, "A weld and a solder seam are the same idea. You take two things that have no reason to hold together and you put heat where they meet until they stop being two things." I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other in my life. We started seeing each other every day, more or less. She'd come out to the shop and sit on a stool and watch me lay a bead, fascinated, and tell me my corner joints were sloppy. And she was right. My corner joints have always been a little sloppy. I'd go to the feed store and hold panels for her and learn the names of the glasses. Opalescent, Cathedral, the streaky hand-rolled stuff she special ordered from the last decent maker in the country. She tested me constantly those first weeks. Not unkindly, but thoroughly. The way you'd pressure test a weld before you trusted your life to it. Throwing idioms at me, regional signs, fast crossfire conversation, watching to see if I'd flag. I never flagged. And somewhere in the second week, she stopped testing, because she'd satisfied herself of the thing she most needed and least expected. Which was that with me, she would never once have to be the only person in the room working twice as hard to be included. I built her something that third week without making an announcement of it. She'd been storing her finished panels leaning against the studio wall, stacked and vulnerable, one careless boot away from a year's work. And it had bothered me every time I saw it. So I spent 2 evenings at the shop after she'd gone home, and I built her a rolling rack out of square tube and angle iron, padded channels to stand the panels in upright and separate, casters so she could move 100 pounds of finished glass with one hand. And I drove it over before she was awake and left it in the middle of her studio floor with a drop cloth over it, like an idiot. When she came in and pulled the cloth off, she went still the way she did when something got past her guard. And she ran her hand down one of the welded uprights, the sloppy corner joints even. And then she signed, not looking at me. You know that's a hard thing to come back from. A man building you a rack so your work doesn't break. I signed that I knew. She signed, just so you understand what you're doing. And I signed back that I had no idea what I was doing. None. And she laughed. And we left it there. And every panel she's made since has lived in that rack. The country church job was the first thing we did, with all four of our hands at once. A little white-framed church out past the dairies had a window Hazel was restoring. A lamb and shepherd panel from 1911 that had bowed and cracked, and the original iron saddle bars that braced it had rusted through, which meant she needed steel before she could set the glass, which meant me. We drove out on a Saturday and worked the whole day in that empty church with the light coming up through the colored dust. And there is a particular closeness to two people working a delicate job together in a quiet place, and is no plot to it, no pressure. Just her holding while I tacked and me holding while she leaded. Our hands crossing in the same 18 inches of space for 6 hours. At one point, I was forming a new saddle bar to the exact bow of the old glass, and I got it wrong twice. And the third time, she put her hands over mine on the cold steel and bent it with me. The two of us reading the curve together, and neither of us moved for a second longer than the work required. And we both knew it, and neither of us said anything about it. Then it nearly went wrong, and I watched her become the most competent person I'd ever seen. We were lifting the restored panel into the frame, the whole thing, 113 years old, irreplaceable, and the old wood of the frame was punkier than it looked, and a screw stripped out, and the top edge of the panel started to lean out into open air with a year of her work and a century of somebody's faith about to come down on a stone floor. I froze. Hazel did not. She got a shoulder under it, fast, and signed at me one-handed, sharp and total. Cribbing under my elbow, the shims now, directing the whole rescue without a wasted motion, and we got it braced and got it seated and stood there both breathing hard with the lamb and the shepherd safe in the frame above us. And she turned to me, flushed, alive, and signed. That's the difference between us. You see a thing about to break, and you stop. I see a thing about to break, and I move. You're going to have to learn to move, Noah. And she didn't only mean the glass, and I knew she didn't, and I didn't have an answer, because she was right. We started calling the combined thing the seam, before we ever called it anything real between us. The work where her glass and my steel met, the line where the two crafts joined. Bring it to the seam. She'd sign when she needed iron behind her light. I'd lie awake some nights thinking in seams and saddle bars about things that had nothing to do with metal. A weld is two pieces that had no reason to hold, I'd think, and you put heat exactly where they meet, and you do not flinch and you do not rush. And when it cools, the join is stronger than either piece was alone. I'd been welding for 15 years, and I'd never once let the lesson out of the shop. She was teaching me to let it out. I took her to meet my mother on a Sunday. I'd been nervous about it in a way I didn't examine, and I understood why the moment we walked into the kitchen, because my mother and Hazel took one look at each other and started signing and did not stop for 3 hours. And I sat there at the table I'd grown up at and watched the two of them go, fast, overlapping, laughing, my mother telling stories about me as a boy that I'd have paid money to suppress. And I realized I was barely needed in the conversation at all. For my whole childhood, that table had been mine to manage. Every hearing visitor a job, every exchange routed through me. And here were the two of them not needing me to bridge a single thing, just talking. Two deaf, fluent women filling the kitchen with a language that needed no help from me. And I felt something I didn't have a word for, which I would later understand was homesickness for a place I was actually sitting in. When Hazel went out to the truck, my mother caught my arm. She'd watched me my whole life, and she missed nothing. "That girl," she signed, "is the first time I have seen you use both your hands and both your halves in the same room. You think you protect yourself, keeping the worlds apart. You don't. You just cut yourself down the middle and call the bleeding peace." She patted my cheek the way she had when I was small. "Stop bleeding, Noah. Let them meet." There was a night at the studio, late, after we'd installed a small window at a country church out past the dairy farms and come back to clean up, when the forward motion of everything paused and one of us finally said the thing under it. It was Hazel. She was sitting on the floor in the colored dark, flux rag in her hands, and she signed slower than usual, the way you sign a thing you've never said out loud. "You want to know my whole life in one picture? Christmas dinner, my family, all of them hearing. Nobody ever learned more than the alphabet. 20 people laughing, and I'm at the end of the table reading the centerpiece. And every so often someone leans over and says, 'Don't worry about it, I'll tell you later.' And they never tell you later. And you spend your childhood learning that you are a thing the room agrees to feel bad about and then forgets." She turned the rag over in her hands. Then I met Grant. Hearing. He learned to sign to get me, really learned, for about a year, and I thought, finally. And then once he had me, he stopped. Said it was easier if I just read his lips. Said the implant surgery would fix everything. Why was I being stubborn? Didn't I want to be normal? He never once thought to ask if I already felt normal. Her hands stilled. I left him on a Tuesday, 2 years ago, and I promised myself I would be alone for the rest of my life before I'd ever again be somebody's good deed. I didn't tell her it would be okay, and I didn't tell her she was brave. I knew better. She'd have hated both. I signed her the only true thing I had, which was, "You're not a thing this room agrees to feel bad about. You're the only person in it I want to talk to." And then, because she'd given me hers, I gave her mine. The bridge, my father, the door I'd shut on half of myself for 15 years, because being whole had only ever meant being needed. She listened the way she did everything, completely. And when I finished, she reached over and traced one of the old burn scars on my forearm, the long, shiny one from a slag splatter years back. And she didn't say anything about it. She just rested her hand over it, and we sat in the colored dark a long time, not signing anything at all, which is its own kind of conversation and the rarest kind. What I didn't tell her, because I hadn't admitted it to myself yet, was the fear that had started up in me. That if I let myself have this, a deaf woman, a whole life back in the silent world, I'd be the bridge again. That I'd spend the rest of my days interpreting and managing and rooting the hearing world through my own hands the way I had as a boy, and lose myself in it the same way. And that the door I'd shut had maybe been shut for a reason. Grant came in April. He came to the gallery night, which was the worst possible place for it, which is to say, the most public. Hazel had 3 big panels in a group show at a gallery in Fort Worth, and half of Stephenville had carpooled up to see the deaf artist's work, Dale and Renee and the church committee and my mother in her good cardigan. And the room was full and bright and hung with Hazel's glass lit from behind, so it threw color across everyone's faces. And in the middle of it, in a jacket that cost more than my truck, came a polished man I'd never seen who walked straight to Hazel like the last 2 years hadn't happened. He didn't sign to her. That was the first thing. He talked, slow and warm and loud, performing patience for the room. "Hazel, you look incredible. Your work, my God, this is what I always said you could do." And she stood there with that smooth, faraway look coming back over her face. The enduring look. And I felt my whole body go cold. Then he saw me beside her, clocked me as hearing the way one hearing man clocks another, and did the thing. He turned to me, over her, and said, "Easy, conspiratorial, like we were on the same side of a thing. You a friend of hers? Good. Listen, between us, somebody's got to talk sense to her. The implant, the whole staying out here alone business. She's got real talent. She should be in a real city with real support, not playing pioneer in a feed store. I still care about her. I just need somebody she'll actually listen to." He said all of it 3 feet from her face, about her, as if she were a window himself and I. And here is the moment I'd been afraid of and didn't understand until it arrived. The old reflex came up in me. Be the bridge. Smooth it over. Manage the hearing man. But I didn't bridge. I did the opposite. I turned my body so Hazel could see my hands, and I started signing everything Grant was saying, in real time, straight to her. He says somebody's got to talk sense to you. He says the implant. He says you should be in a real city with real support, not playing pioneer in a feed store. He says he still cares about you. He says he needs someone you'll actually listen to. I signed all of it, word for word. His condescension laid bare in her own language right in front of him. And I watched Grant's face change as he realized that the deaf girl he'd been talking around for years was getting every syllable. That the room was watching. That the thing he'd always done in the dark was happening in the light. Hazel didn't need me to defend her. She never had. I wasn't her bridge. I was just making sure the room stopped talking over her so she could do what she was about to do. She stepped forward, and she spoke, out loud, in the voice she used when she chose to. Clear and even, and carrying across the whole bright room. I heard all of it, Grant. I always heard all of it. That was the whole problem. You thought talking around me meant I wasn't there. The room had gone silent. You didn't learn my language to love me. You learned it to win me. And the day you stopped having to win me, you decided I should change into something easier to keep. I'm not stubborn. I'm not broken. I don't need fixing, and I never did. And the only thing wrong with my life for 26 years was the number of people exactly like you who were so sure they were being kind. She let that sit. I'm staying in the feed store. I'm staying in the silence you couldn't stand. And she didn't look at me. She didn't need to. Never once made me feel like a good deed. You should go. You know which door. Grant stood there with the whole town and the woman and the colored light all turned against him. And there was no version of the next thing he could say that would make him the man he'd walked in believing he was. And he knew it. And he went. And in the quiet after, my mother, who had watched the entire thing from across the room, caught my eye and lifted her hands and signed, just for me, both halves. Same room, and smiled like she'd been right all along, which she had. The confession came later that night. Back at the studio, the two of us in the dark with the panels leaning against the walls and the streetlight coming through them and laying color across the concrete floor. I'd been quiet on the drive. Hazel finally turned on a lamp and faced me and signed, "Say it. Whatever you've been chewing on since Fort Worth. Use your hands. You're worse at hiding when you sign. You should know that." So I signed it. I almost didn't come on that date. I almost said no because I figured it'd be that same room I grew up in, the notepad and the talking slow, and I was tired of that room. And the truth is, I'd been hiding for 15 years. I shut the door on this whole half of myself the day I got old enough to stop being everyone's bridge, because being the bridge was the only way I ever mattered. and I was so tired of mattering that way that I'd rather be half a man in the quiet than a whole one with my hands always full of other people's words. I made myself keep going. And I was scared of you. Because being with you meant opening that door. And I thought it meant being the bridge again forever. But tonight I understood I had it backwards. You don't need a bridge. You never did. You needed the room to shut up so you could talk, and I can do that. That's not carrying you. That's just standing next to you. I love you, Hazel. I've loved you since you signed "You're Real" across that terrible table. I just had to lose the fear that loving you would cost me myself. And watching you tonight, I finally figured out it's the opposite. You're the first person who ever made me one whole man in one whole room. That's everything I've got. And I'm saying all of it with my hands, so you know, I mean it in the language I mean things in. She was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes had filled and she let them, the way she let everything be exactly what it was. Then she signed, "You're so slow." The same word my whole life seems to draw out of remarkable women. I gave up on hearing men 2 years ago. And then one signs to me across a chain restaurant like it's nothing and ruins my entire plan. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, unembarrassed. I didn't fall for you because you can sign, Noah. Plenty of people can learn to sign. I fell for you because you have never once, not one single time, treated me like a problem to be patient about. You just talked to me. Do you understand how my whole life I waited for somebody to just talk to me? And then she did the thing that broke me clean in half, in the good way, the way that lets two pieces finally hold. She reached up and gave me a name sign. You don't make your own. A deaf person gives it to you. And being given one is a thing that means you belong, that you've been let inside. She took the hand shape for the letter N and brushed it down past her own eye. The path of a welding flash, the bright line of an arc seen in the dark. That's you, she signed. The man who works in the light other people have to look away from. And then she kissed me, and it was not careful, and it was not a joke. And the street light came through her glass and laid red and blue and gold all over both of us. And for the first time in my adult life, I was entirely in one place, with both my hands, with nothing shut. A year and a half later, there's a sign over my shop that I had a buddy letter for me. And underneath Pruitt Welding, it says, "Smaller, in steel I cut myself, re as glass, because we knocked out the wall between the back of the shop and the old storage bay, and Hazel moved her studio in next to mine. We share the compressor and the workbench and the long afternoons. We've started taking jobs together that neither of us could have done alone. A memorial gate for the new wing of the hospital. Steel I forged and glass she set into it. Light and iron in one piece, and people drive out from 3 counties to see it." She was right about my corner joints. Under her supervision, they've gotten cleaner. I was right about nothing, which she reminds me of regularly, in the language she gave me a name in. We got married in the fall, in the Methodist church downtown, under the 100-year-old window she'd restored the month we met. And the whole thing was in 2 languages at once. A hearing minister and a deaf interpreter side by side. My mother in the front row signing the vows along under her breath like she couldn't help it. Half the town had spent the previous year quietly learning to sign, badly, Dale and Renee worst of all. And when they tried, Hazel let them and corrected them, and was kinder about it than they deserved. My mother lives close now. Hazel goes to her on Sundays whether I come or not. They don't need me there, and the not needing is the gift. There's a thing that happens every night now that is the small, true center of my whole life. We turn out the lights, and the bedroom goes dark. and we can't talk the way hearing couples talk in the dark, voices in the black. So Hazel turns on the little lamp on her side just for a minute, and we sign goodnight. Small, lazy, half-asleep signs. The day's last few words in a pool of light before sleep. And then she clicks it off. And we lie there in a silence that for the first time in my life is not a place I'm hiding and not a place I'm working. Just a quiet two people chose to be in together. I spent 15 years believing I'd chosen the silence, the welding hood, the shut door, the half of myself I kept locked up where it couldn't cost me anything. It took a woman signing "You're real" across a terrible bright restaurant to show me the truth, which is that I hadn't chosen the silence at all. I'd been homesick for it my entire adult life. For the house with the flashing doorbell and my mother's hands. For the only place I was ever whole. And I'd locked the door on it because I thought being whole meant being used up. A weld is just two things that finally agreed to stop being two things. You put heat where they meet and you hold them there. And what you get is stronger at the seam than anywhere else in the metal. I had been two things for so long. And then somebody talked to me in the language I think in, and held me at the seam. And now what I am is one piece. And the strongest part of me, it turns out, is exactly the place where the two halves were brave enough to finally come together.